November 2, 1988. A terminal at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge. A young man sits down at a machine that is not his own. At 8:30 that evening, he releases a program onto the network. The program was small. It was written to copy itself from one computer to another without any human help. Within hours, it had reached machines in California, Maryland, and Illinois. Within a day, it had brought a large share of the American internet to a standstill. The man at the terminal was Robert Tappan Morris. He was 23 years old. He was a first-year graduate student in computer science at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. He had traveled nowhere that night. He had simply logged into a machine at MIT from 400 kilometers away. He chose MIT deliberately. He was a Cornell student, so a program launched from Cambridge would appear to come from somewhere else. Anyone tracing it would look at the wrong campus first. His father was Robert Morris Sr. The elder Morris had helped build Unix security at Bell Laboratories. He co-designed the password encryption scheme that protected Unix systems around the world. By 1988, he was chief scientist at the National Computer Security Center, a division of the National Security Agency. The Internet of 1988 was not the Internet of today. It linked universities, military research sites, and a handful of corporations. Estimates placed the number of connected machines at roughly 60,000. Nobody knew the exact number. No central registry existed that could tell anyone. The network ran on trust. Researchers shared accounts and machines freely. A computer at Berkeley could accept commands from a computer at Stanford without a password, because an administrator had once declared the two machines friends. That arrangement was called a trust relationship. The program walked straight through it. The worm looked for 3 doors. The first door was sendmail. Sendmail was the program that carried electronic mail between Unix machines. It shipped with a debugging feature that many administrators never switched off. That feature let a remote connection send commands instead of a letter. The worm used it to hand itself over as a set of instructions. The second door was the finger service. Finger answered one simple question. It told you who was logged in on a distant machine. The program that answered was called Fingered. It read the incoming request into a fixed block of memory without checking how long the request was. The worm sent more characters than the block could hold. The extra characters spilled past the edge and overwrote the machine's own instructions. The machine then obediently opened a command shell for the intruder. Today, this technique is called a buffer overflow. In 1988, almost nobody outside a small circle of researchers had seen one used against a live system. The third door was the trust itself. If a machine already trusted another machine, the worm used that trust to log in as a legitimate user. Where trust was missing, it guessed. It carried a built-in list of around 400 common passwords. It also tried each user's own login name, the name spelled backwards, and words taken from the system dictionary. On thousands of machines, that was enough. Once inside, the worm sent across a short piece of code that programmers later called the grappling hook. It was 99 lines long. The victim machine compiled it and ran it. The hook then reached back across the network and pulled in the main body of the worm. The main body erased its own file from the disk. It changed its name in the process list to look like an ordinary program. It reorganized itself in memory every few minutes so that anyone watching would struggle to catch it. Morris had built in a limit. Before infecting a machine, the worm asked whether a copy was already running there. If the answer was yes, it was supposed to stop. Then he considered a problem. A clever administrator could program a machine to always answer yes. That machine would then be immune. So Morris added a rule. 1 time in 7, the worm would ignore the answer and install itself anyway. That single decision changed everything. Machines began accumulating copies of the worm. Each copy competed for processor time. Load averages that normally sat near 1 climbed past 20, then past 50. Screens froze. Commands took minutes to return. Administrators watched their machines slow to a crawl for reasons they could not see. The first alarms came from Berkeley and from the Rand Corporation before midnight. Peter Yee, at NASA Ames Research Center, sent a message to a national mailing list in the early hours of November 3. He wrote that they were under attack, and he named the sites already hit. At Harvard, a student named Andy Saduth sent an anonymous message describing how to stop the spread. He posted it at around 3:30 in the morning. The network was so badly congested that the warning sat undelivered for more than a day. That was the cruelest part of the night. The internet was the only tool available for warning people about the internet. As machines fell, the warnings stopped moving. Administrators began cutting themselves off to survive. The Army Ballistic Research Laboratory disconnected. Others followed. Every site that went dark also went blind. Through the night, teams at Berkeley and MIT took the worm apart. They pulled the compiled code back into readable form, line by line, with pizza boxes stacked beside the terminals. Gene Spafford, at Purdue University, worked through the same problem and shared his findings. By November 4, the exploited holes were understood and repairs were circulating. The final count was never settled. Paul Graham later explained that the widely quoted figure of 6,000 infected machines came from a rough estimate. Someone assumed 60,000 computers were connected and guessed that 10% had been hit. Clifford Stoll, who watched the response from the inside, thought the real number was closer to a couple of thousand. The United States General Accounting Office estimated the total cost of the cleanup at between $100,000 and $10 million. Morris spent that night watching what he had done. He called a friend at Harvard. Together, they tried to send out instructions for killing the worm, and those instructions were swallowed by the same congestion the worm had caused. His friend then called a journalist. On November 4, the New York Times identified the author of the worm by his login name, RTM. The full name followed within days. Cornell convened a commission. Its report concluded that the release was not an accident and described it as a juvenile act. The university suspended him. Then came the part nobody had planned for. The Computer Fraud and Abuse Act had been passed in 1986. Until then, it had never been tested in a case like this. Prosecutors charged Morris under it, and he became the first person in the United States tried under that law for releasing a program onto a network. The jury convicted him on January 22, 1990, in Syracuse, New York. He was sentenced on May 4, 1990. He received 3 years of probation, 400 hours of community service, and a fine of $10,050, plus the cost of his supervision. He served no prison time. His appeal reached the Second Circuit, which upheld the conviction in 1991. I did the one. The response outlived the case. Within weeks of the attack, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency funded a permanent emergency team at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. It was called the Computer Emergency Response Team. It became the model copied by governments and companies for the next 3 decades. Something else changed, too. Before November 1988, computer security was a specialist concern discussed in a few laboratories. After November 1988, it was a headline. The idea that a single program could travel unattended across a continent stopped being theoretical. Morris finished a doctorate at Harvard. In 1995, he co-founded a company that built the first web-based storefront software. Yahoo bought it in 1998. He joined the faculty at MIT, and in 2006, the institution that hosted the launch terminal granted him tenure. He later helped start one of the most influential startup investors in Silicon Valley. The worm itself was never destroyed. A copy of the source code was written to a floppy disk and placed on public display in Boston. The disk still sits there, behind glass, in a museum.